At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Ever hear a whisper in the dark and think, that's a tomorrow problem? Welcome to Not My Ghost, Not My Problem, where hosts Jen and Kelly share listener-submitted ghost stories, haunted places, and chilling mysteries, all with a wicked sense of humor. It's spooky, it's hilarious, and it might just make you second-guess that shadow in the corner. Believer or skeptic, there's always room around their campfire. Search for Not My Ghost, Not My Problem on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Hit play, and remember, it's only your problem if you acknowledge it.
This story contains detailed references to suicide, graphic violence, mental illness, substance abuse, and war-related trauma. The content may be distressing to some listeners. Please take care. What drives two people to the edge of reality? Where love and madness blur into something unrecognizable. How does a city known for its spirit and resilience become the backdrop of one of the most chilling tales in modern memory? In the shadowed corners of New Orleans, beneath the echo of jazz and the weight of history, a story unfolded that defies logic and demands attention.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
It started as a love story, but beneath the surface, something darker was brewing. Obsession, trauma, and the fragile line between devotion and destruction began to take hold. Behind one apartment door, something unspeakable was taking shape, masked by charm and intensity. It's a story soaked in mystery, wrapped in psychological complexity, and haunted by the question, how well can we ever truly know someone? Zack and Addie were inseparable, intense, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. But behind the walls of the Rampart Street apartment, something was unraveling. The signs were there, quiet shifts, strange behavior, movements, and moments that didn't quite add up. But what happened inside that residence would leave a permanent mark on those who knew them, and on a city that wasn't prepared for the truth. Even now, the question remains, how did love turn into something so unrecognizable? On the evening of October 17th, 2006, staff at the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel in New Orleans noticed something alarming on the roof of the parking garage below. A man's body was lying motionless, having fallen from the hotel's roof terrace several stories above. The impact had been fatal. Hotel employees immediately contacted the police, began standard procedures for investigating apparent suicides. The man had no wallet, no identification on him, but he was dressed in military-style clothing. He appeared to be in his late 20s. As they searched his pockets, they found a plastic bag labeled, "For police only." Inside was a folded, handwritten note and a pair of military dog tags. The name on the tags was Zack Bowen. The note was brief and direct. It stated that Zack had taken his own life because he had taken a life as well, and instructed police to go to 826 North Rampart Street, the apartment where he had been living with his girlfriend Addie Hall. The note also told officers that they would find evidence inside the apartment. The writing was calm and deliberate. There were no signs of panic or emotional distress in the tone. At the scene, police secured the area and began piecing together the timeline. Surveillance footage from the hotel showed Zack entering alone. He had walked onto the rooftop terrace, climbed over the railing, and jumped. Witnesses later reported seeing him at the hotel bar earlier that day. He had been drinking, chatting with the staff, and left a tip on his tab before heading upstairs. There was no visible distress, no erratic behavior. The police followed the note's instructions immediately. What they found at the apartment would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in recent memory. But at the moment, standing on the rooftop of the parking garage, the focus was still on Zack Bowen, his final decisions, the note that he left, and the quiet unraveling of a story that had only just begun. Zack Bowen was born in California in 1978. His parents divorced during his teenage years, and after the separation, he lived with his mother. Just before turning 18, Bowen took a road trip with his father across several states. Their final stop was New Orleans, and Bowen decided to stay in the city, dropping out of high school. His father agreed, but not long after, his father left New Orleans, effectively abandoning him there. Bowen began work in the French Quarters, where he found employment as a bartender. He was described by acquaintances as shy, humorous, and sociable. He listened to metal music and enjoyed playing the guitar and drums. He was known to joke around and was generally well-liked by coworkers and friends. While bartending, Bowen met Lana Shupak, a 28-year-old exotic dancer from Florida. She was visiting New Orleans with friends when they met, and Bowen pursued a relationship with her. She eventually moved to New Orleans. At the time, Bowen was only 18 years old, a fact that he concealed from Lana. She discovered his true age after becoming pregnant with their first child. Their son Jackson was born in 1997. Initially, Bowen was not enthusiastic about fatherhood, and Lana did not inform him of the child's birth until weeks later. Upon meeting his son, Bowen committed to being present and supportive. He took on multiple bartending jobs and moved the family into an apartment in uptown New Orleans. In October of 1988, Bowen and Shupak were married in Jackson Square. Shortly before the wedding, they learned that they were expecting a second child. Their daughter Lily was born June 1999. Bowen worked to support his growing family. He earned his GED and tried to establish stability. However, the relationship faced ongoing challenges. Lana expressed frustration with Bowen's immaturity and inconsistent behavior. The couple experienced periods of separation, and Lana occasionally left with the children. Despite the tension, Bowen was seen as a devoted father. He was observed on walks with his children to school and spent time with them in public. Friends described him as someone who genuinely cared for his kids. In 2000, Bowen decided to enlist in the United States Army, following in the footsteps of his brother and grandfather. This marked a significant shift in his life trajectory. Zack joined the military police and completed basic training before being deployed overseas. His first assignment was in Kosovo, where he served as part of NATO peacekeeping force. He was stationed in a region recovering from ethnic conflict. His duties included patrolling civilian areas, maintaining order, and supporting local security efforts. He received the NATO Medal for his service. After Kosovo, Bowen was deployed to Iraq. He arrived during the early stages of the U.S. invasion. His unit was responsible for checkpoint securities, convoy protection, and detainee handling. He was exposed to combat conditions and witnessed civilian casualties. He received the Presidential Unit Citation for his role in operations. During his time in Iraq, Bowen experienced several traumatic events. One incident involved the death of a young Iraqi boy who he had befriended. He also saw injuries and fatalities among fellow soldiers and civilians. These experiences were not formally addressed by the military mental health service. Towards the end of his service, Bowen began to fail his physical fitness tests. According to accounts from friends and military records, he did so deliberately. He wanted to leave the Army and believed that failing the test would expedite the process. His commanding officer didn't recommend him for an honorable discharge. Instead, he was issued a general discharge. This decision disqualified him from receiving education and health benefits. Bowen expressed frustration and bitterness about the outcome. He believed his services had not been properly recognized. The general discharge marked the end of his military career. He returned to New Orleans and resumed work in the French Quarter. Friends noticed changes in his behavior. He became withdrawn and showed signs of emotional distress. He spoke about his time overseas with a mix of pride and resentment. In 2004, Zack and Lana's marriage came to an end. After returning from Iraq, Bowen's behavior had changed. He was withdrawn, irritable, and emotionally distant. Lana described him as a different person than the man she had married. The couple attempted to reconcile but were unsuccessful. Lana filed for divorce and moved out with their 2 children, and Bowen remained in New Orleans and continued to work in the French Quarter. Shortly after the separation, Bowen met Addie Hall. She was a bartender and poet known for her eccentric personality and artistic lifestyle. Hall had a reputation for being outspoken and unpredictable. She too lived in the French Quarter and was part of the subculture that embraced nonconformity and creative expressions. Addie Hall had a history of trauma. Friends reported that she had experienced abuse earlier in life. She struggled with mental health issues, including depression and anxiety, and Hall often used alcohol to cope with emotional distress. She had violent outbursts and periods of isolation, and despite these challenges, she was described as charismatic and fiercely independent. Friends say that she had difficulty maintaining stable relationships and often pushed people away. She wrote poetry and participated in local art shows. She had a reputation for being fiercely self-reliant and resistant to authority. Her behavior could be erratic, but she was also seen as generous and loyal to those she trusted. Bowen and Hall began dating in July of 2005. Bowen told his mother that he had found his soulmate, and the relationship moved quickly. They spent most of their time together and were seen around the French Quarter. Their friends described the couple as passionate but volatile. Their arguments were frequent and intense. They broke up and reconciled multiple times, and the relationship was marked by heavy drinking and drug use. Both Bowen and Hall had untreated mental health issues. Bowen showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Hall exhibited symptoms from emotional instability. Their connection was strong but unstable, and friends expressed concern about the intensity of their fights and the unpredictability of their behavior. In August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina approached New Orleans with mandatory evacuation orders issued across the city. Zack and Addie chose to stay behind. They remained in Addie's apartment in the French Quarter, one of the few areas spared from catastrophic flooding. But the neighborhood was left without power, running water, or basic services. Most of the residents had fled. The streets were empty. Silence was only broken by the occasional patrol car or distant siren. Both Bowen and Hall worked as bartenders in the French Quarter. After the storm, they returned to their jobs as the city slowly reopened. They served drinks to returning locals and tourists. Their presence behind the bar became familiar, and regulars quickly noticed the tension between them. Their substance use escalated. Alcohol became a daily routine. Cocaine was used reportedly by friends. The couple's behavior grew more and more unstable, and they fought often, their arguments often spilling out into the streets. Neighbors would hear shouting and glass breaking, and friends noticed bruises and emotional outbursts. The relationship was volatile, and yet they remained together. It's at this time that Bowen became jealous of Addie's interactions with male customers. She flirted to earn tips, a common practice among bartenders in the French Quarter, and Bowen resented it. He accused her of disrespecting their relationship, but at the same time, he was exploring his own sexuality. He had been cheating on Addie with both men and women. Addie discovered the affairs and was furious. She viewed his involvement with men as a deeper betrayal. Friends said she took it as a personal insult, and their fights became more and more frequent and even more intense. As the city began to recover, the atmosphere changed. Businesses reopened, residents returned, and the French Quarter filled with noise again. Bowen reconnected with his children, and he began spending more time with them. He wanted to be present in their lives, and this became a source of tension between him and Addie. Addie resented this shift. She had grown used to having Bowen to herself, and she viewed his time with his children as a threat to their relationship. She accused him of being dishonest and questioned his loyalty. Again, this increased their fighting. Friends noticed changes in Addie's demeanor. She became more withdrawn, drank more, and spoke about ending the relationship. Bowen, on the other hand, tried to balance both worlds. He worked long shifts and visited his children, and he returned to Addie's apartment each night. The strain, however, was visible. He had
Lowe's knows that no matter your paint project, saving is at the top of your list. That's why when you shop today, you can buy one, get one free select Valspar and HGTV Home by Sherwin-Williams one-coat coverage interior paints via rebate. Shop these deals in-store or online today at Lowe's. We help, you save. Selection varies by location. While supplies last. Discount taken at time of purchase. See sales associate for details. Offer valid 8/21 through 9/3.
started to lose weight and stopped returning phone calls. He spoke less, and this only added to Addie's suspicions. She would search his belongings, and she became known for starting public arguments with him. In October of 2006, Zack, Bowen, and Addie Hall moved into a new apartment on 826 North Rampart Street, located above a voodoo spiritual temple. The building was old and shadowed by history, known for its spiritual associations. Bowen provided the first and last month's rent. He viewed the move as a commitment, a chance to restart their relationship. But Addie had other plans. When it came time to sign the lease, Addie insisted on putting only her name on the document. She told the landlord that she would be signing the lease alone and that Zack wouldn't be signing at all. She believed that he had been cheating and didn't want to be legally tied to him. When Zack found out, he was furious. He saw the lease exclusion as a rejection. The argument escalated quickly, and Addie began shouting about his infidelity. She accused him of sleeping with other women and with men, called him a liar, and said that he had humiliated her. Then the fight turned violent. Zack Bowen strangled Addie Hall in the early hours of October 5th, 2006. Her body laid on the bed. He didn't call anyone. He didn't leave. He just turned the air conditioning to its lowest setting, and then he laid down beside her and fell asleep. When he woke, he went to work. He served drinks. He smiled at customers. He returned home to the apartment each night. The body remained untouched. The room was cold, the windows were closed. He stayed there for days. Eventually, Bowen withdrew $1,500 from his bank account. He spent the next 2 weeks in the French Quarter, buying drugs, paying for lap dances, tipping generously, drinking heavily. He visited strip clubs and bars and told his friends he was celebrating. He said nothing about Addie. Then, on October 17th, 2006, Zack Bowen walked into the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel, ordered a drink, paced against the terrace, and then he looked down at the parking garage below before he jumped. The note in his pocket told the police where to go next. 826 North Rampart Street. The police entered the apartment above the voodoo spiritual temple. They slowly climbed the narrow staircase. The door was locked and they had to force their entry. Inside, the air was cool. The thermostat had been set to 60 degrees. There was no strong odor and no immediate signs of decay. But spray paint covered the walls, black lettering uneven and frantic, saying things like, "I am a failure. Call my wife. Please help me stop the pain." The messages were written at eye level, some trailing off mid-sentence. One wall bore a phone number. Lana, Bowen's estranged wife, scrawled in thick strokes. But the most haunting was in the bathroom. In large block letters it said, "Look in the oven." In the kitchen, set on the counter, officers found a spiral-bound journal. It was Addie Hall's diary. The earlier pages were clearly written by her, entries about bartending shifts, frustrations, and fleeting moments of joy. But then the handwriting changed. Bowen had taken over. He had used her diary to document the aftermath of the murder. He wrote with precision. The first entry was dated Monday, October 16th, 2 a.m. He stated, "I killed her at 1 a.m., Thursday, 5th of October. I calmly strangled her. It was very quick. He described laying beside her body. He said he felt no remorse, and that's what scared him the most. He noted how he turned the air conditioning down to slow decomposition. He continued, I spent the next day cleaning up. Had to keep her body hidden and the AC on full blast. I went to work, came home, and pretended everything was normal. The entries continued across several pages. He detailed his emotional collapse. He described burning himself with cigarettes, one for each year of his life, 28 in total, claiming he was a failure each of these years. He wrote about his military service, his failed marriage, his children. He said he had nothing left. He said he was tired. The final pages were erratic. The writing grew sloppier. He repeated phrases, I'm sorry, I can't stop, I don't know who I am anymore, and then he signed his name. Bowen also claimed in the journal that he had sexually assaulted Addie's body after her death. However, police found no physical evidence to support this claim. The autopsy did not confirm it. Investigators noted the absence of trauma consistent with this allegation. The diary was left open on the counter. The pages were stained. The ink had bled in places. The apartment was cold, and the oven door was closed. It stood in the center of the kitchen, sealed with duct tape like a tomb across the front. And in black spray paint were the words, "Do not look." The stove was off cold, and the refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. The police removed the tape and opened the oven. Inside, Addie Hall's dismembered body had been arranged with grim precision. Her arms and legs were placed in disposable tinfoil roasting pans inside of the oven. On the stovetop, 2 large pots, one containing her head, the other her hands and feet. Her body had been cooking for so long, the muscles and tissues were charred and pulling away from the bone. Her torso had been wrapped tightly in plastic and had been stored in the refrigerator. There were no signs of cannibalism. The autopsy confirmed that Zack Bowen had not ingested any human tissue. Despite early media reports, there were no vegetables or signs of meal preparation. The dismemberment was not ritualistic, nor was it meant to be theatrical or revenge-based. It was merely a response to the decay. In Addie's journal, Bowen described how he disposed of the body and his thought process behind it. He wrote how after noticing the smell, he realized he needed to remove the body somehow. So he moved her into the bathroom and began cutting up her body with a handsaw and knife. He cleaned the tub, scrubbed the apartment, and then he turned the thermostat down to slow decomposition. But the smell persisted. In his own words, I got rid of the smell by cooking her body parts. The autopsy confirmed that no human flesh was found in Bowen's system, and the police ruled out cannibalism. There was no attempt to flee, no effort to hide what he had done. The apartment remained undisturbed for days, the horror methodically arranged, waiting in silence to be discovered. But Rampart Street wasn't the last place in New Orleans to bear witness to a love story turned violent. Years later, another brutal killing would surface, one that felt eerily familiar. What made it more unsettling wasn't just the method or the media frenzy that followed, but the fact that the suspect had once known Addie Hall. Their paths had crossed in the city's undercurrent of artists, drifters, and dreamers. And now, that connection would resurface in a case even more fragmented than the last. In the early morning hours of June 6, 2012, Jaren Lockhart stepped out of a Bourbon Street club and into the humid New Orleans night. She was 22 years old, a dancer, a mother, and by all accounts, exhausted. The shift had been slow, tips were thin, and rent was due. She was seen leaving with a couple, Margaret Sanchez and Terry Speaks, who had been lingering in the club asking dancers if they would come to a private party. Lockhart agreed. She never came back. Days later, along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, pieces of a body began washing ashore. First the torso, then the limbs, scattered across beaches in Hancock and Harrison counties. The remains were dismembered with precision. Tattoos had been cut away. Identification was difficult, but DNA confirmed what investigators feared. The body belonged to Jaron Lockhart. The cause of death was a single stab wound to the chest. Police traced the surveillance footage from the club. It showed Lockhart leaving with Sanchez and Speaks. Witnesses said the couple had offered her $700 to dance at a party. They weren't strangers. Sanchez had worked with Lockhart before. They were reportedly friends. The trail led to a house in Kenner, near the airport. It was there investigators believe that Lockhart spent her final hours. There was no party, no guests, just the couple and a plan that had already been set into motion. What followed was the killing, a dismemberment, and a disposal. And then came the connection, one that sent a chill through everyone familiar with New Orleans' dark history. Margaret Sanchez, one of the people charged in Jaron Lockhart's murder, had once been close friends with Addie Hall. Before Addie's own murder in 2006, before Zach Bowen left her dismembered body in their apartment on North Rampart Street, she and Margaret had danced together on Bourbon Street. They ran in the same circles, worked in the same clubs, and shared the same chaotic energy that defined the French Quarter in the years after Hurricane Katrina. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Two women, both dancers, both bartenders, both drawn into violent relationships, both dismembered, both connected, but not by circumstances, by friendship. This eerie overlap between the deaths of Addie Hall and Jaron Lockhart has fueled speculation ever since. Some believe Margaret was deeply affected by Addie's murder. Others wondered if the violence she later committed was a twisted echo of what had happened to her friend. Whether a horrifying coincidence or something more disturbing, the connection between these two cases remains one of the most unsettling chapters in the city's recent history. As the account of Zack and Addie was shared, additional elements emerged, some stemming from unverified stories rather than established facts. The apartment where Addie was murdered sat directly above a New Orleans historic voodoo museum and temple. That detail alone was enough to ignite a wave of speculation. Some claimed that Zack had been possessed. Others suggested that the temple itself had somehow influenced the violence, as if the building carried a curse or dark energy. It didn't take long for the media and amateur sleuths to latch on to the idea. The proximity to the voodoo was framed as ominous and even sinister. Headlines leaned into the mystique. Documents and blog posts speculated about spiritual interference, and the story became less about two broken people and more about the building that they lived in. But in doing so, the narrative veered into dangerous territory, misrepresenting an entire spiritual tradition and reinforcing long-standing stereotypes. Voodoo is a legitimate Afro-Caribbean religion rooted in West African spirituality, Catholicism, and indigenous practices. It is centered around ancestral reverence, healing, and community. Rituals often involve music, dance, and offerings, not curses or possessions. The portrayal of voodoo as a benevolent force, especially in the context of Zack and Addie's story, is not only inaccurate, but deeply disrespectful. Critics of the coverage pointed out how these narratives feed into colonialist and racist tropes, painting voodoo as something dangerous or evil. In reality, the temple below the apartment was a place of spiritual practice and cultural preservation. Its presence had nothing to do with the tragedy that occurred above. Yet, the stories persisted. Tourists began referring to the apartment as haunted. Some even claimed to feel a dark energy when walking past. The idea that Zack was possessed became a convenient explanation, an easy way to make sense of something senseless. But the truth is far more human. Zack Bowen was a war veteran struggling with PTSD, substance abuse, and emotional instability. Addie Hall was a woman trying to navigate her own trauma in a city still reeling from Hurricane Katrina. Their story is tragic, but it's not supernatural. The Voodoo Temple was just a neighbor to the crime, not the cause of it, and the continued sensationalism around it has done more to obscure the truth than to reveal it. What happened between Zack Bowen and Addie Hall was not the result of curses or spirits. It was something far more insidious, something that crept in slowly, without ritual or warning. It was the kind of darkness that lives in the mind, untreated and unspoken. Mental illness is rarely cinematic. It doesn't announce itself with thunderbolts or blood. It festers. It isolates. It rewrites reality in small, imperceivable ways until the person inside is no longer recognizable. Zack's descent didn't come with a scream. It came with silence, with withdrawal, with the slow erosion of self. In Zack and Addie's case, it was the silent architect of their unraveling. After Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans became a city suspended between survival and collapse. The floodwaters receded, but the damage remained, visible in the wrecked homes, the abandoned hospitals, and the silence where neighborhoods used to be. Infrastructure was gutted, services were scattered, and for those who were already struggling, the city offered little in a way of refuge. Mental health care, already underfunded before the storm, was decimated. Clinics closed, records were lost, therapists and caseworkers fled or were reassigned. What remained was a patchwork system, overwhelmed and under-equipped. For many, there was nowhere to go, no one to call. There was no help coming. In this vacuum, trauma festered. The city became a pressure cooker of untreated grief, anxiety, and despair. People drank more, tempers flared, violence surged, and amid the chaos, Zack and Addie drifted further from anything resembling stability. They were part of post-Katrina fringe, young, transient, and largely invisible. Their days were spent in bars, their nights in dim apartments. The routines of normal life had vanished, replaced by survivalism and escapism. The city's lawlessness mirrored their own. There were no rules anymore, no boundaries, just the slow erosion of self. Isolation became their default. Friends came and went, jobs were lost, and the drinking escalated. Cocaine became a regular companion, and with each passing day, their grip on reality loosened. The apartment above the Voodoo Temple became kind of a fortress, sealed off from the outside world, echoing with arguments, silence, and the sound of something coming undone. The tragedy of Zack and Addie wasn't just personal, it was systematic. They were casualties of a city in crisis, of a mental health system that had already collapsed under the weight of disaster. Their story is not just about two people. It's about what happens when trauma is left to rot, when care disappears, when the storm outside becomes the storm within. Zack returned from war with PTSD that went unacknowledged and unaddressed. The military had trained him to endure trauma, not to process it, and he carried the weight of combat in his body in his sleep, and the way he flinched at sudden sounds or stared too long at nothing. But there was no roadmap for healing, just a discharge and a city in ruins. Addie's bipolar disorder was equally neglected. In a culture that often romanticizes mania as creativity and dismisses depression as weakness, she was left to navigate her extremes alone. Her highs were dazzling, filled with energy, charisma, and impulsive brilliance. But her lows were cavernous, and without consistent treatment, she swung between these poles with increasing volatility. Together they formed a volatile feedback loop. Zack's trauma fed Addie's instability. Addie's unpredictability triggered Zack's hypervigilance. They were both drowning, but in different oceans, and instead of reaching for help, they reached for each other. clinging to a relationship that felt like salvation but functioned more like a slow-motion collapse. The tragedy is not just that they were sick. It's that they were invisible. Their suffering was normalized, even romanticized, in post-Katrina landscape where chaos was expected and dysfunction was the new baseline. There were no interventions, no diagnosis, no one to say this isn't love, this is illness. Since the event, Zack and Addie's story has become mythologicalized, twisted into a dark romance that captivated the public's attention. Tour guides in the French Quarter pointed to the apartment above the voodoo shop as if it were a haunted landmark, not the site of a human tragedy. This romanticization is not unique to their story. It is part of a broader cultural tendency to glamorize suffering when it's wrapped in mystery, youth, and beauty. Zack was a handsome war veteran. Addie was a striking bartender with a magnetic personality. Together they fit the mold for doomed lovers, star-crossed and self-destructive. The narrative was irresistible, but it was also deeply misleading. What gets lost in this retelling is the reality of untreated mental illness, addiction, and systemic failure. The story becomes beauteous, reduced to moody photographs, whispered legends, and sensational headlines. The violence is stylized, the pain is abstracted, and the people at the center of it are no longer seen as human beings, but as characters in a gothic tragedy. This kind of storytelling does more than distort the truth. It erases it. It allows society to consume trauma without confronting its causes. It turns suffering into entertainment and ignoring the systems that perpetuate it. Zack and Addie didn't die because of passion. They died because they were sick, unsupported, and invisible in a city that had lost its safety nets. Tourism thrives on stories like theirs. The apartment becomes a stop on ghost tours. The crime scene has become lore. But no one talks about the lack of mental health resources, the trauma of war, the instability of bipolar disorder, or the way that Katrina left thousands psychologically stranded. The real horror isn't the crime, it's the silence that preceded it. The apartment of Zack and Addie, where their story ended, is now a part of a guided tour. Visitors shuffle through the narrow hallway above the voodoo temple left by narrators. Some come out of morbid curiosity. Others are drawn by the allure of the macabre. But few leave with a deeper understanding of what really happened there. In recent years, the commercialization of their story has reached unsettling extremes. Tour companies have added theatrical props, fake blood splattered on the walls, dim lighting to mimic the crime scene, even mannequins posed to suggest the final moments. It's not history, it's horror theater, and for many locals, it's gone too far. New Orleans has always leaned into its dark past. The city's identity is steeped in ghost stories, voodoo legends, tales of murder and mystery. But there's a line between honoring history and exploiting pain. When tragedy becomes a theme park attraction, something sacred is lost. The humanity of the victims, the complexity of the circumstances, and the dignity of the dead. Residents and mental health advocates have voiced their outrage. They argue that the tours trivialize suffering, sensationalize mental illness, and ignore the systemic failures that led to the tragedy. Instead of educating the public, they entertain it, reducing a deeply personal story to a grotesque spectacle. The apartment isn't a haunted house. It's a former home, a place where two people struggled, loved, and ultimately broke. This kind of spectacle reflects a broader discomfort with confronting real pain. It's easier to dress it up in blood and shadows than to talk about PTSD, bipolar disorder, addiction, and the collapse of care systems. But until we shift the narrative from shock to understanding, from voyeurism to empathy, we risk repeating the same mistakes. We risk turning every tragedy into a commodity. Zack and Addie's story deserves more than props and ticket sales. It deserves reflection, accountability, and most of all, a commitment to ensuring that others don't fall through the same cracks. Zack and Addie's story is not just a cautionary tale. It's a mirror. It reflects the fractures in our system, the silence around mental illness, and the ease with which tragedy can be consumed rather than understood. Their lives were marked by beauty and pain, by love that burned too brightly, by a city that couldn't hold them. But in remembering them, we have a choice. We can choose to look beyond the spectacle, to see the human beings behind the headlines, the suffering beyond the myth. We can demand better care, deeper connections and compassion, and stories that honor truth over trauma. We can build systems that catch people before they fall. New Orleans will always be a city of shadow and light, of music and mourning. Its stories are stitched into the cobblestones, whispered through the oaks, and carried on the river. Zack and Addie are a part of that tapestry now, not as ghosts, but as reminders of what happens when we turn away, and of what's possible when we choose to see. So let the mysteries guide your way. Let them teach you to look deeper, to ask harder questions, and to hold space for the stories that ache. Let their memory be a call, not to fear the darkness, but to light a candle within it. As the lantern flickers, this is Amanda Joy. For more haunted histories, whispered truth, and stories that linger, be sure to follow me on TikTok and on Instagram @DownTheCrookedPath.